Hi, I'm Lionel Windsor, a New Testament lecturer at Moore College in Sydney. And this is the sixth of a series of videos where I'm explaining what obedience and submission mean in a book of the Bible called 1 Peter. I've recently written a scholarly article about it in a journal called the Global Anglican. I thought it'd be helpful to make my research a bit more accessible for everyone. So that's what these videos are all about. Now, today we're looking at a passage in 1 Peter where the words obey and submit are used in relation to wives. This is a slightly longer video than the others because the issues particularly matter here. Why do they matter? Well, they matter because Christians throughout the world accept the Bible as God's authoritative word. And how we understand the actual meaning of obedience and submission have big implications for our relationships, including marriage. Now, for example, when modern people hear the words obey and submit, they often think about specific situations where a person suppresses their will or grudgingly follows an order. Now, if you assume that's what Peter means, and the Bible here sounds like an instruction to surrender to coercive control or violence. Now that's way out of step with what the Bible says all over the place elsewhere. We saw that in the first video. It's just terrible. It's wrong to go down that line. It's not true. This matters for me personally, as my wife and I help women who are experiencing intimate partner abuse. We're helping them to stay safe, to escape from this abuse. And as they seek to take action to be safe and escape, it's really important to get the meaning of these terms in 1 Peter in the Bible right. And the problem is that the original Greek terms for obedience and submission can easily be misunderstood when they're rendered in modern English. But there's another issue that sometimes people use. People use strategies to deal with the problems, especially something called post-colonial interpretation. And those strategies end up creating their own problems. Okay, so let's dive into it, shall we? In previous videos we've seen that the words for obedience and submission in the ancient Greek language don't primarily mean always following specific orders, despite what many modern people often assume when they hear those words. It's what it can sound like in English. Instead, obedience means heeding a person or message. That is, hearing them and responding appropriately. And submission is about voluntarily placing yourself in various ordered human relationships. Well, this will look different depending on the particular ordered relationship involved. We've also seen that the reason Peter instructs Christians to submit and do good is not just for pragmatic reasons like survival or resistance or mission, despite what many post-colonial interpreters claim. Instead, Peter gives theological reasons. Christians are to submit and do good because God is creator, because God is judge, and because God, through his Son, Jesus Christ, is redeemer. We've also seen that chapter 2, verse 17 is really important because it contains the big ideas that set the scene and govern the instructions about submission that follow. Two very important instructions in chapter 2, verse 17 are firstly, honour human beings, and secondly, fear God, which means respect God as awesome and as the ultimate authority. But those two commands together, they create a tension. That is, how can believers fear God as the ultimate authority when they also need to submit and honour human beings who are often out of step with God's will? So there's a tension there. In the last video, we looked at how the Bible advised submission to play out for first century slaves who were Christians. We saw two important things. Firstly, when slaves have crooked masters, submission sometimes means not following orders, but doing good instead. Secondly, Peter does not explicitly tell slaves to surrender to physical violence. So they're just two important things that set the scene for this chapter. In this video, we'll be looking at the issue of submission for a different circumstance: wives of non-Christian husbands. Okay, so here, Peter deliberately moves to talk about a different circumstance of submission, and literally he says, likewise wives, submitting to your own husbands. Now first we need to clarify the word likewise. Some people wrongly assume that when Peter uses this word likewise, what he's doing is he's saying that everything he's just said about slaves also applies to wives. You know, as if Peter thinks wives are pretty much like slaves. But that is not what likewise means here. Now, that's because of the Greek syntax, which I show in my article if you want the details. Everything goes back to the general commands in chapter 2, verse 17. What Peter's doing is he's saying that there are various circumstances of life where the commands of chapter 2, verse 17 apply. One circumstance to apply those commands in chapter 2, verse 17 is that of slaves submitting to masters. And another, different circumstance where you apply the commands of chapter 2, verse 17, which is not necessarily the same in all its details, is wives submitting to husbands. So what Peter's doing here is he's just saying slaves should honour humans and fear God by submitting in this way. That was the end of chapter 2. And similarly, wives should honour humans and fear God by submitting in this way, which is a different way. Now, Peter is interested in a specific situation. He's talking to a specific situation. It's not the only possible situations where wives should submit to husbands, but what Peter's doing is zeroing in on one particular situation among others. It's an important situation for his purpose. That's because it's a situation where a woman's commitment to fear God seems to be in tension with her commitment to honour her husband. So as a Christian woman, how can she both fear God and not fear human beings, and also honour her husband? And this is a particular situation, to be even more particular, it's a situation where wives have been trying to share the gospel of Jesus Christ with their husbands, but the husbands aren't yet persuaded by it. Now, of course, Peter thinks it's a really good thing for women to speak the gospel to their husbands. We can see that later in verse 15. But the question he's addressing here is, well, what happens when the husband isn't persuaded? How can the wife both honour her husband and also fear God? It actually sounds like a real dilemma. After all, in the ancient world, wives would have been expected to worship the gods of their husbands. So if a woman speaks the gospel of Jesus Christ and demonstrates her commitment to Jesus Christ and her fear of God rather than her fear of others, she potentially dishonours her husband. So what does God want her to do? Well, Peter says in this case, the woman doesn't have to keep speaking the gospel over and over and over. Instead, the woman can honour her husband through her conduct. Now, this will hopefully lead to the husband being won over to Jesus as her actions amplify her gospel words. That's because her conduct itself is gospel conduct, pure conduct that's done in the fear of God. And in that way, wives can both honour their husbands and fear God. So what's the basic meaning of submission for a wife here? It's about honouring her husband, and so upholding the integrity of the ordered marriage relationship. It's not the ultimate thing. The ultimate thing is the wife's bigger commitment to God and Christ. What does submission actually look like in this situation that Peter describes? Peter spells it out in verses 3 and 4. He says, your adornment shouldn't be the external kind, involving elaborate hairstyles and wrapping gold ornaments and clothes around yourself, but the hidden person of the heart, with the imperishable kind of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is valuable, or literally expensive, in God's sight. Now, Peter's not saying that a woman should never wear clothes. He's not saying that women should never do their hair or never wear jewellery. That's not the point. His point is for the woman and the wife here to honour her husband by not dressing provocatively to win attention. That would actually be shameful to a husband rather than honourable. Instead, the wife should focus on the kind of things that are good and right. In fact, the kind of things that Peter talks about here are good and right for all Christians. The kind of things that we see applied to both men and women down in verse 16, as well as in 1 Timothy chapter 2. They are the gentle and quiet spirit. So the idea is not to fight or argue, even though the husband isn't interested in heeding the gospel. And it's good for Christians to do these things, and it's especially honourable for women, for wives. It's an attractive thing. God willing, it will lead the husband to being won over to Jesus. Now, sometimes people argue here that Peter's just echoing first century conventional ideals for wives. This is especially the case when it comes to post-colonial interpreters. In post-colonial interpretation, the idea is that Peter's just providing a survival strategy for Christian wives. And the idea is that in this post-colonial understanding, when non-Christian husbands see that Christianity is basically the same as the ideals of society around them, it conforms, then they'll be happy and the wives can survive. On that understanding, we shouldn't apply these instructions to every circumstance. So, for example, the recent global commentary prepared for the 2022 Lambeth Conference claims that there are Christians today who live in patriarchal societies, like the Third World, and they will probably apply these instructions directly as a survival strategy for living in an ungodly system. But they say Christians today who live in better non-patriarchal societies like Westerners don't need to apply these instructions directly. But I don't think that's true. There are at least 4 reasons why not, why I don't think what Peter's doing here is just saying conform to the conformity of the patriarchal structures around you. Why don't I think that's what's going on here? Well, firstly, using the word submission for marriage, it's actually a Christian thing. Using that word, it's not a conventional ancient Roman or Greek thing. And some people will say, oh yeah, submission, everyone was saying that wives should submit to their husbands in the ancient world. They didn't use that word very much. And as we've seen, submission is not primarily about following specific orders. It's about voluntarily placing yourself in an ordered relationship. When it comes to marriage, especially here in 1 Peter, submission is primarily about honouring the husband and upholding the integrity of the marriage. But that's not the way that order in marriage is normally described in the non-Christian sources in the ancient Greek-speaking world. They don't talk about it like that. When Greek authors like Aristotle, Plutarch, Josephus, Arius Didymus, Philo describe ordered marriage relationships, they actually use words more directly related to politics and the economic sphere. So those non-Christian authors, they won't use words like submit. They'll use words like control and rule and leadership and government and even slavery. But the Bible doesn't do that. It uses the word submit, which is not about control or rule or even about leadership in that sort of secular business sense. Now, yeah, there is one place I've found. I've done as much research as I can. I've tried to find how this word is used. There's one place I found where Plutarch, who's not a Christian, does use the word submission when he's talking about marriage. But when he uses the word submission, he's not talking about control or rule. At that point, he's focusing on honour and order. And he's saying at that point that wives have an honourable status in marriage, like philosophers have an honourable status in society. So that's the point when he uses the terminology of submission. Elsewhere, when Plutarch's on about control and rule and leadership and those kinds of things, he uses other words. Okay. Second reason why I think that Peter here is not just echoing the conventions of society around him is that the ideals of modesty and gentleness and honour, they're found all over the ancient world, and they're found in the Old Testament. So just because Peter talks about modesty and gentleness doesn't necessarily mean he's conforming to the ancient world. In fact, you look at the Old Testament, Proverbs chapter 31. These ideals are directly linked to the fear of God and not the fear of humans. So it's much more likely that Peter's drawing from the Old Testament here. And that's even more clear in the following verses. Peter deliberately does turn to the Old Testament to make his point. We'll see that in a moment. Thirdly, when Peter talks about fear, he's reminding wives that they should ultimately fear God, not humans. That's not about conforming. It isn't a simple survival strategy. It's about living for God and doing what's right and honourable. And fourthly, Peter's actual language for wives is not conventional. It's actually quite radically Christian and apocalyptic. Peter doesn't get these descriptions for wives from the society round about. He gets it from what he's already said about Christians back in chapter 1. It's apocalyptic language. That is, it's about living now in light of the future appearing of Jesus. Back in chapter 1, for example, here's examples. Back in chapter 1, Christian faith is more expensive than gold. Here in chapter 3, wives' adornment isn't about gold ornaments, but it's expensive in God's sight. Another example, back in chapter 1, our inheritance and God's word is imperishable. Silver and gold is perishable. Here in chapter 3, the wife's gentle and quiet spirit is imperishable. The same Greek words. Here's another example, back in chapter 1. We don't see Jesus yet, but he will be revealed. Here in chapter 3, the wife's adornment is hidden rather than external. So Peter is not giving a conformity or survival strategy for wives. He's calling them to a radically Christian, apocalyptic lifestyle. They should live in a way that is ultimately commendable to God, the creator and judge of all. So whether or not they have outward, exothen, outward human approval is not the issue. After all of this, Peter moves on to the example of Sarah, the wife of Abraham from Genesis in the Old Testament. He says, "For this is how the holy women who hoped in God in the past adorned themselves, by submitting to their own husbands, as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord." Okay, so what on earth is going on here? If we assume that obedience and submission means following specific orders, like lots of people do, then actually this claim of Peter's doesn't seem to make any sense at all. Let's look at the passage in Genesis where Sarah calls Abraham Lord. That's what Peter's referring to. But in that passage, Sarah is not following specific orders. She's actually laughing at the idea that she can have a child with Abraham, since they're both geriatrics. Okay, so it doesn't seem to make sense. What is Peter doing here? I want to say that if we understand obedience and submission, not according to the common way it's often understood in our world, that is obeying specific orders, but if we understand it according to Peter's understanding that he's laid out in the rest of his letter, then this reference to Sarah does actually make sense. Remember, what's obedience in 1 Peter? It's not about just following specific orders. What it is, it's about hearing and heeding a person or a message, leading to a reorientation of attitude. What's submission in 1 Peter? Again, it's not just about following specific orders. It's about voluntarily placing yourself in an ordered human relationship. Now, do you know the story of Sarah, Abraham and Sarah in Genesis? I'll just give you a brief highlight, a brief recalling of that story, but I'm going to highlight particularly relevant bits. The first is you read Genesis. One of the things you notice is you keep hearing Sarah being described very pointedly, and actually redundantly, as Abraham's wife. So she's not just called Sarah, she's called Sarah, Abraham's wife. When God talks to Abraham, he doesn't just say Sarah, he says, Sarah, your wife. Why? Because Sarah is the one who is expected to bear the great child of promise with Abraham. But to start with, Sarah doesn't act as Abraham's wife. She can't conceive. So she decides to give another woman to Abraham to have a child with. And this actually undermines the marriage relationship. It undermines Sarah's honour. It undermines her status as wife. And Abraham heeds Sarah he obeys Sarah, he listens to her. That means he has a child through the other woman. And that's actually a disaster for the marriage. You can see it in Genesis. It's quite disastrous, and it's clearly not God's plan. God says to Abraham in Genesis, "No, Abraham, you're going to have a child through Sarah. Sarah, pointedly, your wife." Finally, when the message does get through to Abraham, Sarah responds. And even though she's laughing, there's a very clear clue that she's honouring Abraham as her husband, that she's had a reorientation of attitude, because she calls him my Lord, that is, my husband. See, she's heeding Abraham. She's now preserving the integrity of the marriage. She's obeying and submitting, as Peter understands those words. So that means that Sarah is a model of submission and obedience. But she's not some perfect idealised picture of how to always follow a husband's specific orders. That's not what Peter's saying. No, Sarah is a real example of a woman in hard circumstances who learned to heed and honour her husband under God, because ultimately she's learned to hope in God and his promises. So how do Christian wives follow Sarah's example? By honouring their husbands rather than by being provocative or arguing. That's what it says early on. By trusting God in hard places. And this is what Peter says in verse 6. By doing good and not fearing any intimidation. That's really important. To understand this, it helps us to look at the Greek version of Proverbs 3 in the Old Testament, where a similar phrase is used. Fear God and turn away from every evil, and you will not fear intimidation when it comes, nor the attacks of the ungodly when they approach. What's Peter saying here? He's saying that actually, ultimately, Christian wives are to fear God, which means doing good, not evil, and it actually means not giving way to intimidation, not giving way to human attempts to intimidate you. There's a parallel here with what Peter said previously when it comes to slaves and Jesus. That is, submission sometimes involves doing good, even when you're being intimidated not to do good. So he's saying here, Peter is actually saying here, wives are not to give way to coercion, intimidation, control. That's even intimidation from husbands who might coerce or intimidate them. Peter's saying, don't give in. Fear God. God is more powerful than they are. So keep doing what is right. So just to be completely clear, 1 Peter certainly does not say that abuse is okay. It certainly does not say that wives should put up with abuse or control. In fact, going further, 1 Peter explicitly and literally says the precise opposite. Peter specifically encourages wives, or husbands for that matter, not to put up with intimidation. It is right not to endure abuse, to seek safety in such circumstances. Now this whole thing's completed by an instruction for Christian husbands. Likewise, husbands, living with your wives with understanding, as of a weaker vessel, the female, showing them honour, as also to those who are fellow heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that your prayers may not be hindered. Remember back in chapter 2 verse 17, the big instruction was to honour all people. And so in chapter 3 verse 7, Peter talks about how husbands are to honour their wives. And husbands are to honour their wives not as second-class Christians, but with equal dignity, as fellow heirs of God's grace. See, there is no inferiority of worth or status here. Peter uses the phrase, a weaker vessel, the female. He's not talking about inferiority. He's just acknowledging the truth that women are very often more vulnerable. He's saying that husbands need to understand this and honour them fully in those circumstances. Again, just see how clear Peter is that abuse is never okay and wives should not tolerate it. So what are the key points from all of this? Here's a summary. Firstly, Submission for a wife is not primarily about following specific orders. It's about honouring her husband and so upholding the integrity of the ordered marriage relationship. But ultimately, wives are to fear God rather than human beings. Peter's language for submission isn't conforming to first century conventions. It's radically Christian and apocalyptic. And note that Peter explicitly encourages wives not to put up with abuse, control, and intimidation. There is absolutely no excuse from 1 Peter for condoning abuse or encouraging wives to put up with it. Well, that was a long one. The next video will be shorter. And we'll look at what Peter means when he talks about submitting to church leaders. So I'll see you in the next video.